So now we're gonna finish. That's the third part of the third part of the first part of the talk, which is about programming these hit weapons and getting the tools ready. So now we have identified the types that we're after. Now we're just gonna need to see how do we prepare those weapons or those formats. So the short and long intervals and so on. So when it comes to preparing our weapons, there are 12 variables that could be actually used to prepare those hit formats. The first and most important one is the intensity of exercise. And we're going to discuss a little bit further how do we set up the intensity. Then obviously, duration of the interval is important. And that's probably if you have to choose only two, these are the two most important. You're going to say, I'm going to run at this speed for how long? But then you need to know as well if you break and how long do you break. So intensity of work, duration of work, intensity of the recovery, duration of the recovery. With those four, you have, for example, I'm doing a 15-15. The 15 second, I have to run 80 meters, and those other 15 seconds, I just rest. So with those four, you get an idea of what the players will have to do. But on the top of that, you can also discuss the duration of the series, how many repetitions you have to do. For example, 8 repetitions of 15-15. That will be a 4-minute block, for example. How many series you do? You do just one time 4 minutes, you do 2 times 4 minutes, or you do 1 time 8 minutes, for example. Then as long as you have series, you may have to indicate as well in your prescription the number, the intensity and the duration of the rest between those series. And overall together, they will dictate the number 9, which is the total volume of exercise. Additionally, and importantly for us, when it comes to modulating the neuromuscular load of a session, is to consider the work modality or the ground surface. Are we doing this 15-15 on a treadmill or on a grass? Are we running straight lines or are we changing direction? That's very important in terms of neuromuscular demands of a session. Further than that, and I won't be spending much time on this lecture about that, but you have also the environmental condition in which those intervals are performed. Are those intervals performed on the pitch in a normal condition, or are we performing these intervals in a heat chamber, for example, or in an altitude chamber? And that relates to the other course that I've been giving on using the environmental factors to create further adaptation. Last but not least, number 12, the nutritional status. Again, there are now some new evidences suggesting that people could sometimes implement and perform sessions in a fasted state, for example, which will have different metabolic, which will trigger different metabolic adaptations, like especially triggering the oxidative capacity of the muscle fibers, or to help to utilize more fat, for example, when those sessions are performed in a low glycogen mode, for example. But let's go back to the programming of those sessions on the pitch with our players, and focusing on the tools we have to calibrate the intensity of those intervals. Because as you will know, the intensity of the intervals is probably the most important aspect when it comes to programming intervals. So there are many ways, and like most of people in the past have just been training hard, so kind of using an RPE level of 8 or 9, and as soon as it looked hard, they thought they would be in their zone, in the high red zone. But obviously, we need to be a bit more precise. I don't think it's really worth spending more time thinking about using heart rate for short intervals prescription, because obviously, with the lag and the inertia of heart rate, it's just impossible to use it to make sure players are running at the right pace, right intensity. So what is left for us, and what is obviously very practical in practice, is to use a reference speed, for example, or an external clue, so that we can provide running distance, running targets to players, so that they can start to train individually on their own at their own speed related to their own fitness, but at least giving them targets will help them to make sure they reach the required intensity. So what are the different options to find a reference external load target? So to me, most practical is to use the results of an incremental test, for example. So back in the days and for a long time, people have been using what we call VO2 max or maximal aerobic speed, which is the speed that is reached at the end of a kind of an incremental test. The interest of VO2 max or maximal aerobic speed is that it takes into account not only the engine, the cardiovascular potential of an athlete, so not only VO2 max, but that also integrates his running economy or his ability to change direction and so on if the test is performed with change of direction. So in that case, if you think about the initial tests that were developed by Léger in the 90s, the typical tests involve running shuttles for 20 meters for a minute, and every minute the speed increases and so on. In the example on that slide, you see how two players with almost, or in that case, with the same VO2 max, so the same aerobic potential, can actually reach different speed, different performance on the test, just because one will be more efficient than the other when turning and changing direction. So in that case, you see the heavier handball player, which has likely, because of his body mass, a worse ability to change direction. So his VO2 will increase pretty quickly as the speed requirement increases. And once he reaches his VO2 max, he will have ability to run for a few more stages, but then he will stop, in this example, at 14 kilometers per hour. We have the other player, way more agile, lighter, better coordination. With the same VO2 max, because he's more economous, he will be able to reach a way faster speed on the test, even though both of them have the same capacities in terms of VO2 max. But the second one has a better locomotor efficiency, and then he will reach a higher speed. So what matters in the end, when we program intermittent exercise, is to use, obviously we couldn't use VO2 max to program, but in that case we're going to use their own maximal aerobic speed or their own V incremental cell speed to each of them, so that each of them is actually now training at his own maximal aerobic velocity in this case. So that's, to me, the best way to start to think when it comes to implementing and targeting a proper intensity at the individual level for those players. But most of the time, when we train and when we implement short intervals, for example, we perform those intervals at a speed that is actually higher or faster than maximal speed or V incremental test or VO2 max, for example. And if you look at this graph, we're now thinking about the concept of what we call the anaerobic speed reserve, which is a representation of the locomotor profile of an athlete, where we have as the top of the graph, or the top of the locomotor spectrum, we have maximal sprinting speed. So that's the maximal movement, locomotor capacity of the athletes, how fast as they can run maximally. In that example, we have player A that can run at 29 maximally, player B probably 31 or 32. So we have a fast player and averagely fast player. Both of them in this example have the same VO2 max. Both of them have the same speed associated with their VO2 max, same VO2 max, or same maximal aerobic speed. So in that case, if we were just using VO2 max and have both of them running a 15-15 at, for example, 20% or 25% of their VO2 max, let's say running at 21.5 kilometers, as we've been doing. So we've been having everyone doing this maximal aerobics test and everyone working at 120% of those maximal tests. The actual proportion of the reserve that is going to be used during this 15-15 will actually be different for those players. Even though we're using the same percentage of the VVO2 max, the percentage of the reserve is different. Player A has a small reserve because he doesn't have much speed, it doesn't have much anaerobic power as well, likely. So player A will actually be using 32% of his reserve during this interval, while player B will only be using 23% of his reserve. And in terms of fatigue resistance and in terms of the actual load of these sessions, that means a lot. In other terms, the session, even though will be programmed using a similar percentage of VVO2 max, the session will have a dramatically different impact in terms of fatigue and metabolisms for both players. And that shows clearly the limitation of using only VO2 max when it comes to programming intervals. Because VVO2 max in that matter doesn't actually reflect the overall locomotor profile of the athletes. It's just representing the cardiovascular aerobic side of things, but it doesn't include the neuromuscular and anaerobic part of the profile, which actually matters a lot when we train supramaximally, when we train above VVO2 max. So for that reason, and that was probably about 20 years ago now, I had to, or I kind of realized myself that we needed probably to find another way to find out this reference speed to implement high-intensity training. So the idea was to design a new test, not trying to reinvent the wheel obviously, but using what has been done, what has been developed in the past, and trying to find something that will be more related to the player profile, so not just be related to VO2 max, but that will actually be affected or be representative of the anaerobic speed reserve while still being useful for training prescription. And that's when I came to the test called now the 30-15 intermittent fitness test. So basically, I took the idea of the typical 20-meter shuttle runs from Luc Léger in the 90s, but I just broke it down with rest periods so that the test becomes intermittent, because we trained in an intermittent manner. We train with rest periods, so let's make the test with rest as well. And then in terms of length of speed, the reflection was that those 20 meters were not sufficient for players to really reach high speeds. And when we want to assess, or when we train, we often train over a long space or larger space to get a little bit of high-speed running in the legs as well. And also we need to evaluate players when they change direction at high speeds. So just those 20-meter shuttles looked a bit short. So then I developed the test over 28 or even 40 meters shuttles, so that there are higher speed reached during the runs and then when player turns. And then finally, the test is following the same types of increment in speed as the other tests. In that case, every 30-second stage is actually performed 0.5 kilometers faster than the previous one. And as you can see in the bottom graph, the speed that is actually reached at the test is clearly above VVO2 max. Because in that case, when players reach their VVO2 max, because of the recovery phases that they went throughout the test, they still have some power, some energy left, so they can keep on going a little bit further. And the speed that they reach is around 20-25% of their anaerobic speed reserve. So the setup is pretty simple. Players have to run back and forth in between two lines. I provide for free at the moment. If you just send me an email on my website, there will be an app available pretty soon, downloadable for on iPhones and Google Play as well, so that all the audio files will be accessible easily. But the idea is just to follow the pace with the audio file and make sure you are on each of those lines when the beep sounds. So you can see now a video, practical example of the setup of the test. That was done in an AFL, Australian Football League team probably around 2013, I would say, in Adelaide. So in that case, we have two groups staggered, one behind the other, depending on how many players. In that case, they have many players, so they're better to do that like that. If you have a shorter group, you could just have one group of players running all together. But as you can see, they're all starting on one line. They are now resting for those 15 seconds. As soon as these 15 seconds will be finished, they will run again for 30, going back and forth. There are different cones. So nothing very complex. Turning, in this case, they're just turning every 40 meters, going back and forth. So a bit of a description of the performance across representative sports and playing standards. Just a selection in that case. But the idea obviously is that the older and the higher the playing standard, the better the performance. That's an example for women. That example for men. As you can see, the best performance are observed for adult male national teams or first teams. And obviously, as you go down in terms of playing standard or age, performance decreases. The idea of the test, as I try to convince you at the start, is that really it goes beyond just the assessment of maximal aerobic speed, and we then found